could you tell us a bit more about the role of feminism in the Russian Revolution?
Well, there are a lot of people who don't fully recognize how important the role of feminism was. Even something as simple as this mass industrialization, largely coming from the West, which completely exhausted the Soviet labor force. And therefore, Stalin had to figure out a way to get women away from the family and to get into the factories. And so even in the 30s, the concept of feminism developed simply as a way to increase the labor force. Today, it's to lower wages. Same thing for immigration. In the 1970s, the male-dominated workforce, especially in the industrial fields that women were not involved with, were at their height in terms of earning power, the power of unions and everything else. That had to be crushed. And the only way to do that was to increase not just the number of available laborers, but make them different, even at war with one another. So there can't be any cooperation. So mass immigration, getting women into the workforce, creates distrust, creates contempt. And when you have a group of people who are willing to work for less, the value of labor goes down. That's its modern conception. It exists all over the place. But in old Russia, it really comes from the freeing of the nobility from state service. And this was done under Catherine the Great. They were forced to serve the country. That's what justified their position as aristocrats. These are the men who led revolutionary movements. They were not quite capitalist, they were not traditional, they were ideologically confused, completely secular, very much indebted. And these were the men who, the families that were targeted from Russian monarchs from Ivan III onward. So this led ultimately to the Decembrist Revolution, which was a Masonic movement of high-rank aristocrats, especially military officers, who wanted to keep Nicholas I from taking over after the alleged death of Alexander II. The Wives of the Decembrists was a proto-feminist movement in old Russia. The most powerful and elite names in Russian life engaged in the Decembrist movement. And they're lionized as democratic by the American historical establishment. You go through these names, and it's the most powerful. Volenskaya, Trubetskaya, Morieva, Narskina, all of these major female names of these high-level aristocrats. And what the Decembrist males were doing politically, the women were doing personally and on the level of the family. Revolution can't occur just in the political realm. It has to occur also in the social realm. It's not well known, but turn of the century in Petersburg, some of the most powerful noble families were consecrating themselves to Dionysius. The societies using the crystal palace as their symbol. The desire was to bring the Parisian manners to Russia. To be Parisian from Paris was to be Bohemian, to be a revolutionary. Using gypsy choirs written elsewhere, very libertine, very non-Christian, brought Dionysian feelings to their apex. And of course, alcohol was a big part of this. These were idle, rich, old noble families that had nothing to do, since they were not required to serve the state like they used to. Bureaucracies, military were being replaced by actual merit, not these people. And that's when you have the spiritualist movement, the salons that predated the French Revolution developing here. Deeply involved in Freemasonry and Jacobin politics, and the females certainly had other pastimes. Right after the Decembrist movement, which was crushed, of course, women were deeply involved in all of this. The Decembrist protest was not just against the monarch, but it accepted norms of social behavior. This was the concept of women's self-consciousness, the so-called emancipation, not even consciously. Post-reform Russia, post-1861 Russia, destroyed the ideal of the woman as a servitor. And slowly, this idle rich began to see women as the object of male desire. The elite crust of urban high society absolutely led the way in destroying Russian manners and customs. And there's literature, Peter Brokin in his Evening Sacrifice, came out in 1868, about orgies during Lent, which was considered, increasingly normal. Wife swapping. By the time of the Revolution, divorce was very easy to get if you were a wealthy family from Petersburg. It had been completely secularized. The church, the monarchy had very little to do with any of this. The Bacchanal societies became very powerful. But Broken also wrote Classmates in 1900, quoting the heroine about how easy it is to get a divorce. Wife swapping became important. Orthodoxy became really a symbol more than actual any reality. And around this time, female clothing was getting more seductive. The literature of the day was filled with references of the African passion. That's a euphemism for unbridled lust. And this was developing in these idol-rich societies and those who were trying to imitate them. The Athenian society, so-called Athenian Vespers, all of these local societies that come from these idol-rich families in Petersburg and elsewhere were introducing the sexual revolution, which is another way of introducing feminism. Because if a man now doesn't have to worry about his family, if a man can indulge any sexual appetite, well, that automatically puts that power in the hands of women. Women now have a newfound power to choose who they want. Obviously, the way around that, if it's rape, is an extreme example. But normally, it puts a tremendous power into a woman's hands that they never had before. Sexual revolution automatically leads to that level of feminism. This was developing after the so-called reform in 1861, which reached its zenith not too long afterwards, a few years later, in the Decembrist Revolution. There, for the first time, this revolutionary ideology from Britain and elsewhere created a very, very different type of female. So by the time the actual revolution took place, 1905 and 1918, you had a huge female auxiliary involved in things like the sexual revolution and abortion and everything else, which were unthinkable not too long before then. So that's this development, and not a whole lot. The literature reflects it. Not a whole lot of history reflects it, though. This hasn't really penetrated the American historical psyche quite yet.
There's a link between sexual radicalism and political radicalism. And Wilhelm Reich, whose ideas were involved with the Frankfurt School, he saw, as he put it, that the sexual process of society has always been the core of its cultural process. And what you've outlined there in terms of the wives of the Decembrists, I think, is a good example of that.